obviously in a military organization, it's logical that there ought to be accountability. And I looked at, there's two chains of control in the military. One is the operational chain, which goes from the president to me, to the combatant commander, down to the deputy, and then down to the commander in that area, and then the individuals conducting the detention. It was obvious the people conducting the detention had not provided proper oversight. It was obvious, but not legally obvious, but practically obvious, that the people performing those acts, that there were photographs, were acting against the law and needed to be punished. And that's easy. They were. They were court-martials, they were punished, and it went right up through a general officer in that immediate area. But there wasn't anyone senior, because I had replaced some people in the operational chain of command previously, and the new ones were just barely there. The next obvious person was a general, a three-star, I think, at the time, named Sanchez, who was in charge of the country. And he was, if you wanted the heads to roll, that was the obvious place. And I looked at that, and he was one of the most junior division officers, and he was put in charge of the country, which he should not have been. The Army moved him into that position, and in my judgment, it was a mistake. He was too junior. Second, the Army had the obligation of staffing his headquarters. His headquarters was staffed basically for a division. It was not, this is before we had the brigade combat teams, it was not staffed for a country. And I investigated it, found out what he had requested, what he needed for his division, for his staff, and it was, when I found out about it, it was at about 67% of what he needed. I had approved the full 100%. The Joint Staff and the Army should have taken action to do it. It didn't get done, and I felt it was unfair to him to fire him. Maybe right, maybe wrong. So I submitted my own resignation to the president and said, this is a terrible thing that's happened. The world has to see that there's accountability. I gave him my resignation. He came back the next day and said he didn't want me to resign. And he said, what about firing General Myers, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs? Or what about firing someone else? And I said, you have the wrong person. That happens, that you know, when a ship goes aground, the skipper gets fired. And so 2 days later, 3 days later, I gave him a lengthy letter, handwritten letter, explaining why I should resign and submitting my resignation, and telling him that that's the way it ought to be, and that's the only way it ought to be. He came back to me, I guess a day or two later, and said he would not accept my resignation. He thought I was wrong. In retrospect, I wasn't wrong. I think I was right. And I think the Department of Defense would have been better, the military would have been better, the country would have been better if the American people and the world had seen that by golly, when something that terrible happens, there's something is actionable, something happens, and somebody else comes in with fresh eyes and tries to fix whatever was broken. It was unquestionably the worst period of my service over those 6 years. And I don't even like to talk about it. Well, but I write about it in the book.
We won't anymore tonight.
Painfully.
So shortly after combat operations began in Iraq, the issue, which has continued to be a recurrent one, of were there enough troops deployed to do the job? And partly because I think of some of the things we were talking about earlier in terms of transforming to a modern military with smaller, lighter combat brigades. I think a lot of people thought that, well, in Afghanistan having been able to be done with smaller ones, that Secretary Rumsfeld was hell-bent on going in with a super light force. That's
that's the popular narrative, and it has the problem of not being correct. I think it was Dwight Eisenhower who said, planning, he said, the plan is nothing, planning is everything. Now, why would he say that? He said it because with first contact with the enemy, all your plans go out the window. The enemy's got a brain. You get out there, and the things you anticipate may or may not happen, the things you didn't anticipate may happen, and no matter what happens, it's going to change, because as you move forward, everything, the enemy looks at what's happening and makes adjustments, just as our people. For every offense, there's a defense. For every defense, there's an offense. And General Franks and his team had a responsibility for Phase 4, which is the post-major combat operations period. They had extensive plans. The Department of State had plans. The National Security Council had plans. There were responsibilities that spanned the entire range of the national security. We had 450,000 troops in line, ready to go in if they were needed. General Franks had some off-ramps and said, if we don't need them, we're not going to run them in. And he made a recommendation at some point, I forget what level it was, that he would use the off-ramps and that he had accomplished what he needed to accomplish. And he made that recommendation to me. I agreed with him. I don't know of anybody who disagreed with it. And that was the decision. It didn't have anything to do, it had something to do with, well, I can't say this for him, but I know he got the same message I did from the neighbors. I mean, you go around and see the King of Jordan, you go around to Mubarak in Egypt, any single person in the region, they did not want a lot of troops in that country. They did not want us to stay long. They wanted Saddam Hussein gone, and they wanted it finished, but they did not want to see a non-Muslim country occupying a Muslim country for a long period. And as a result, the decision was made, I forget what the number is, where the off-ramp started to be used, and at that point it was fine. Obviously, over time, several things happened. One was Saddam Hussein let 100,000 prisoners loose in that country. That's a lot of people, and bad people. Second, the army was basically Shia conscripts. The officer corps was 1,500, I think that's the number, Sunni generals. So when the Americans came in, our forces came in, the Iraqi army, instead of fighting fiercely, a lot of the Shia conscripts left, and they went home. Saddam Hussein, while he was still alive and before he was captured, put out a call for jihad. And people started streaming in from Syria and across the Saudi border and from other countries, North Africa. So the remnants of the Sunni government created a party of return. They wanted to go back and take over the country. You had the prisoners that were released. You had the jihadists coming in from Syria and Iran and various other countries. And this aggregation began to gel into something that the U.S. intelligence community had not predicted, namely an insurgency. And it was not serious immediately, but it built over time. It was building. And as it did, we raised troops periodically from time to time. There were other things that affected it that made it difficult. I think the de-Baathification process was probably more stringent than it might have been. It had the effect of leaving the Sunnis that had governed that country for many years with the impression that they were on the outs and that the Shia were going to control the country. And because to be a senior official in that country, a school teacher, running a power plant, you had to be a Baathist. And many of them were Sunnis. And so the de-Baathification program was kind of like the de-Nazification program in Germany after World War II. You didn't want to put the Nazis right back in power in Germany. So the U.S. leadership, military and civilian in Germany, had a process where they prevented senior Nazis from positions, but you had to figure out how deep do you want to go. I mean, a lot of the school teachers and power plant operators weren't dedicated Saddamists, they were Baathists because they had to be Baathists. And so that program was probably administered too stringently by a Shia named Ahmed Shalabi. And it was then toned down, the Coalition Provisional Authority. But a whole series of things like that combined to create a longer, in my view, an occupation, a Coalition Provisional Authority occupation with a U.S. face as opposed to an Iraqi face for a longer period, which I think contributed to recruits for the insurgency.